It's extravagant to spend thousands upon thousands of dollars and 5 years of your family's life and emotional energy pursuing a child that you've never met. But these children are worth it, and the God who created them is worth it. And it is a privilege, whether through biology or adoption, to become a parent.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of The Bulletin. In this episode, Mike Cosper and I talk with adoptive mom and advocate Amy Welch about China's recent decision to close their international adoption program. Next, Mike and I sat down to watch the first presidential debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and we're breaking it down today. Finally, Bob Smetana joins us to talk Taylor Swift and Brittany Mahomes and maintaining friendships across difference. Welcome to the show. After almost 3 decades, China suddenly announced it was closing foreign adoptions last week, leaving hundreds of families already matched with children stuck in the process after having their adoptions placed on hold due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Chinese authorities have told the U.S. government that all pending adoptions have been canceled. This news has left families reeling and scrambling to figure out what happens next. Joining us to talk more about this is adoption advocate and adoptive parent Amy Welch. Amy, welcome to the Bulletin.
Thank you, Clarissa. We're so grateful for you taking time to focus on this issue.
So, Amy, after 30 years, what prompted China to end its international adoption program? And what's the current fate of these almost 300 children who were in the paperwork phase of being adopted?
It's really not clear. The reasons that they have given so far are very vague. It's come down from their Ministry of Civil Affairs, which is not the part of their government that normally deals with adoptions, instead of the Center for Children's Welfare, which normally has oversight. So there remains some hope that our State Department will be able to speak with them to intercede on behalf of the children whose adoptions were already in process and get clarity. We're hoping that there has just been some terrible mistake.
Now, many countries have wrestled with the optics of international adoption. It looks bad if your nation can't care for its own children, so to speak. And others have made decisions to close their programs because of fraud or trafficking concerns. Do you sense that these are part of the concerns of the Chinese government?
Again, they have not given a reason, and I'm hesitant to speculate. But what I can say is that this has been a very successful area of humanitarian cooperation between our countries for 30 years. It's been a win-win for China, for the US, for families, and most importantly, for vulnerable children who really cannot thrive in the same way outside of a family's care. What we're hearing is that about 169,000 orphans remain in China, and that really only about 30% of them are being able to be cared for in state facilities, whether that is orphanages or a few nonprofit run homes or in foster care situations. Our daughter in waiting, Penelope, as we call her, is in a home that is run by a nonprofit. It's essentially like a group foster care home for children with her special need. There are about 30 children in the home with just a few workers.
Now, 2 decades ago, China's one-child policy, plus that cultural preference for male babies, meant that healthy baby girls were the most vulnerable children available for adoption. But that seems to have changed. Now, with the end of this one-child policy, better economic, medical conditions, that 98% of children I read had been relinquished by their biological parents because of disability or serious illness. Who is the typical child who is available for adoption or was at the time of China's closing?
You're exactly right. This old stereotype that people have in their minds that China's orphanages are full of well baby girls is just completely a thing of the past. Today, The orphanage population in China is about 50-50 male and female, and almost exclusively children with special needs. And I would make the point that the 300 children who wait, 100% of them have special needs, ranging from things like spina bifida to Down syndrome to autism, blindness, deafness. And in every case, they really just are not able to get the therapies and medications and tailored care and nurture that they could get in a family. I would also make the point that there's been a wonderful progression in China to greater cultural openness to adoption domestically. However, the children that have been adopted domestically are primarily younger with few special needs. And the children that we families are waiting to bring home are ones who have waited for a very long time. Our waiting daughter, Penelope, was 5 when her paperwork was even prepared for her to be available for adoption. And we actually chose the name Penelope after the mythological figure who waited for years for her loved one to return, thinking that that was because she had waited 5 years for a family and having no idea that another 5 years would lapse without answers for her. And I think every adoptive family is just haunted by this question of these little ones that we have loved for so long. If we do not come for them, who will?
Mike, this feels like something happening at a very, very delicate time in geopolitics.
There's been escalation of tension for a variety of reasons, whether it's issues over trade, issues over sort of normal relations, exchange of citizens, diplomatic relations, or the more intense tensions that are taking place right now in the South China Sea of a variety of sorts. This plays into this broader reality of a world we're living in where the norms that we could expect for the last 2 decades are starting to crumble. For 2 decades, we've had pretty much, call it free trade or whatever else you might want to call it, with China. For 2 decades, there's been a policy with Russia and Eastern Europe and of feeling like we were trying to move a culture that had dropped the Iron Curtain into the norms of trade and culture and exchange with the West. There's been all this effort that has taken place in the years, particularly, since the election of Barack Obama in 2008. There was this sense that whatever was taking place in the Middle East, there was kind of a move towards normalization with the West there as well. All of that feels like it's being put on hold for various reasons. So you have 3 diverse sort of global conflicts and tensions that are escalating for a host of reasons. And what is heart-wrenching about it is that I think this story, perhaps more than any story I've encountered in all of these geopolitical conflicts, this story highlights so perfectly the human toll of this kind of escalation. Because at the end of the day, what listeners won't know is that Amy Welch is a good friend of mine. She's a good friend of our family. Their daughter, Grace, who was also adopted from China, is one of my favorite human beings on the entire planet. She's a bundle of joy, and my heart breaks because I think these are the opportunities that are being foreclosed by a cutoff of adoption. A story like this, a story of a girl like Penelope and a family like the Welches who have waited for so long and are being cut off in this moment, it should break our hearts. Absolutely.
It seems that in this moment of pause, and we hope that it is indeed just a pause, that it offers us as onlookers, as Christians, as communities, opportunity to really reflect on what adoption is. As we think about these children who are waiting, there are a lot of myths about international adoption that are embedded in Christian culture. And I wonder if this is a moment, Amy, for us to kind of dispel some of those things, to really dive a little bit deeper, to learn about the trauma of separation, the struggles to attach, the grief and loss that marks adoption. Do you think that there is opportunity now for Christians to kind of expand or shift in their understanding of what adoption means as they see these families who are waiting in this tension?
As I think about adoption, it just starts with the value and worth of every human being. And that is something that in these tense times we need to remember. Every one of these children deserves a family. And adoption is not about finding children for families, it's about finding families for children who wait. Adoption is not always easy, but I love to say that hard does not mean bad. It is something worth sacrificing for. The image that I carry in my heart, have carried in my heart this past week, has been of the woman who poured out ointment on Jesus' feet from a broken bottle. And it was extravagant. It's extravagant to spend thousands upon thousands of dollars and 5 years of your family's life and emotional energy pursuing a child that you've never met. But these children are worth it. And the God who created them is worth it. And it is a privilege, whether through biology or adoption, to become a parent. And that also is a value that I think is decreasing in our society. Birth rates around the world are going down as people consider the costs of raising children. And I think we need to remember, this makes me remember every day what a privilege it is to parent the other children in my home, to get to be their mom, to even in a sense lose some of my identity just in getting to fulfill that role for them. I want to not only be the mom of Zachary Graham, Thaddeus Caleb, and Gracie Welch. I long to be the mom to Penelope. And I know that that is the heart of every waiting family. And I would also say, for these waiting families, that we have done the work. This is not something where we got caught up in the spur of the moment and thought, like, oh, we're going to come in as these saviors from the outside. We have done the initial training. We have updated our trainings year upon year upon year about cross racial parenting, about bonding and attachment, about dealing with institutional trauma. We have stared these hard realities in the face, and we are stepping forward by faith, even after, in our case, we planned to adopt a 5-year-old when all 5 of our children were still at home. Our family situation has completely changed, and we know that there will be additional hurdles in the life of this little girl if we are privileged to bring her home. It's going to be much more challenging to adjust to a new culture and a new home, and even to learn what a family means at 11 than it was at 5. It's going to be completely different for us in terms of bonding and attaching to her. And that, honestly, it's a scary thing, and it's not something that we take lightly. But out of this broken situation, we would just want to honor the God who made these children and pour our lives out for them, because Jesus gave his life for us.
We know that most of the children who are adopted from China are older, like you describe. Many of them have complex special needs. How do you see the church stepping forward to support in these more unique kind of adoption situations where you need something more than just diapers and formula, but you're going to need some longer term wraparound support to really thrive as a family?
I think that adoption agencies, adoption related nonprofits, and church communities, our church, for instance, has a foster and adoption ministry. Across the board, no one has rose colored lenses about the challenges that exist in adoption, whether it's domestic or international. And we know that it isn't just a situation where love alone is always enough. Love is the starting point, but we need good psychological support. We need trauma informed counselors. We need community. We need people to hold up our arms when we are weary. And I'm thankful for the professionals that are coming alongside families to support them in these ways. And I think there's a whole growing ministry there that has really looked the realities and the challenges in the face and is still stepping up.
For Christians, the idea of adoption is central to our faith. And Mike, as we think about these children who are waiting, as we think about the families who are waiting for them, how can we think about adoption in light of what we are seeing play out here?
One of the things that I think is fascinating in a moment like this is it reminds us of fundamental theological set of stakes that are here. I'm prone to quote Hannah Arendt on this podcast, and I'm going to do it again. She says, no matter how despairing you get about the world, remember that a group of barbarians are born into every generation, ready to make things new. We just call them children. And it's one of the magic of children is that when children are born, when children come into the world, when children come into their own, they come with their ideas and their vision and their imagination and their inspiration. It is no mistake that when the Savior of the world came to the world to transform it, he came as a child. And it is also no mistake that when his enemy attacks the world, he attacks children. When we see kids suffering in any circumstances, it should drive us to prayer. So, my hope and prayer is that the grace and the mercy and the providence of God breaks through in a situation like this to bring kids like Penelope home. Kids we've been praying would come home for a very long time. I mean, since I met Amy, 3-4 years ago, and we first heard this story.
Despite the dark things in our culture and the challenges that have waxed and waned in our relationship with China for these 30 years on a political front, despite all of our vast differences between our political convictions in America and the government of China, adoptions have been able to really proceed on a separate humanitarian track through every up and down. This has been a unique, rare, and precious area of cooperation between two world powers for the good of the most vulnerable people on our planet. I hope that it doesn't have to end. I would pray that China would reconsider. I trust that our government is interceding at the highest levels on behalf of waiting children. But no one disagrees that China has absolutely the right to close down international adoptions going forward. But my personal appeal on behalf of my own waiting child and the 300 other children who were promised families is that those promises would be kept. It would be such a very small thing for China to allow these 300 children to be united with their families as they agreed to do, but it would be such a big thing in the life of each child and family.
Thank you, Amy, so much for joining us today. We trust that God holds these little lives securely in his hands. We will be right back. On Tuesday night, Americans sat down to watch presidential hopefuls Donald Trump and Kamala Harris duke it out in their first and perhaps only debate before Election Day. It was a night of cats and dogs, windmills, and foreign policy. Never a dull moment in the almost 2 hours worth of programming that we enjoyed. Mike, as you prepared to watch the debate, and we had a special opportunity, we got to watch it together in person. What thoughts were running through your head as we queued up the live stream?
It's fascinating when you think about who Donald Trump is and how long he's been part of our presidential politics. He's in year 8 of presidential debates. So he comes in with a ton of experience. He comes in after June, in which he really just sort of held the line, tried to mostly sort of just react to a certain degree of infirmity and whatnot that we saw in Joe Biden and sort of let that be the story of the debate. And it felt like coming into this one, he had one mission in this debate, which was that Kamala Harris remains fairly undefined to the populace. Some people know, like political junkie people know who she kind of defined herself as in 2019. A much smaller segment of voters know kind of who she was as a senator and the California politics that she came out of. But what she has mostly focused on since taking on the nomination, and I think people use this derogatively, and I don't mean it that way. She's mostly focused on sort of vibes and mood. She's mostly focused on, do you want to go back or do you want to go forward? So for Donald Trump, the opportunity that was in front of him was to define her to voters in a way that she hadn't been defined yet. The way you do that is you go, here's a policy, defend it. Here's a policy, defend it. Here's what you think about this. Here's what you think about that. Defend it, defend it, defend it. And A disciplined candidate could have probably had a field day with that, particularly because the Harris and Walz campaign has been so resistant to definition in many ways. We are not dealing with a disciplined candidate. We're dealing with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump did what Donald Trump does, which is that he came in with a certain amount of a game plan. Kamala Harris baited him on several issues. And from the moment he took the bait the first time, it was all downhill from there for them. All she had to do was not lose her cool, continue to point out what was wild and crazy and unpredictable happening on the other side of the stage, and she could win the debate. And that is, I think, quite clearly, whether you like Harris and are cheering for her, which I am personally not, or not, it's impossible to deny that she walked out of there looking much more presidential, much more composed, much more focused on issues where Donald Trump once again revealed himself to be very focused on himself and his grievances.
Yeah, I think about how Kamala Harris walked out on stage and pursued Donald Trump for that handshake at the beginning. And I learned later that she's only 5'4", so she is a small woman and he's a big man. And what a projection of power and confidence that she brought to that stage. And I wonder if that kind of unhinged him a little bit at the beginning there. We heard a lot of interesting things in the debate, things that seemed to be spin-offs from conspiracy theories and memes and whatnot. But the one that stood out was Donald Trump's conversation about eating dogs. Can you tell me, why were we talking about eating dogs and cats in a presidential debate at all?
Really, since the rise of Donald Trump, one of the things that you've seen on the online right for a very long time is a lot of anxiety, fear-mongering, conspiracy theories, and urban legends around what's happening with immigration. So everybody remembers the migrant caravans. The migrant caravans are coming and they're going to take over the country. There's been many, many other versions of that over the years. So it was funny. We were sitting together with a group of people and watching the debate, and he mentioned Springfield, Ohio. And I think I literally shouted out loud, he's not going to do it. He's not going to go to Springfield, Ohio. Like, there's no way he's going to Springfield, Ohio. But he just mentioned it and he moved on. And then when he came back to it about 5 minutes later, he came back to it with the quote, "They're eating our dogs, they're eating our cats, they're eating our pets." So for listeners who are unfamiliar with this, there is sort of an urban legend / conspiracy theory online about how Haitian immigrants that are living in Springfield, Ohio, were eating people's cats, and that they were eating the ducks and the geese out of the local park, the local pond, that sort of thing. There's two pieces of evidence for this. One is a local police from a different township, police body cam of arresting a woman who is clearly very, 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 very high and has eaten something. And the cop is asking her, "Did you just eat that cat?" Look, I lived in the inner city for a long time. I lived around a lot of meth head types, meth addicts, cocaine addicts, crack addicts. People do crazy things. Was this about her being a Haitian immigrant? No. In fact, she was not a Haitian immigrant, as other reporting has come out to prove. The other piece of evidence that they've been pointing to is a photo of a black man walking down the street with a very large bird of some sort in his arm. Looks like the bird is dead. Here's the proof that they've been catching geese at the local park and killing them and eating them. Turns out that this was also not from Springfield, Ohio. The police department of Springfield, Ohio has said, we have no active investigations into the theft or murder of pets. We have no active complaints of anybody saying that any of this sort of thing is happening. Apparently, the only evidence which, since the debate, that Republicans have offered to try to sort of back up these claims are the fact that people have been calling J.D. Vance's office to complain about what immigrants are doing in their communities, which is odd because J.D. Vance's office really doesn't have much to do to help them. It's classic. Let's back up one step further. The first time that this story was reported, it was actually reported at a city council meeting. And the guy who reported it to the local city council is the leader of the local neo-Nazi gathering. So just to be clear, the Republican nominee for president of the United States stood in front of the American people and his opponent and propagated a conspiracy theory about Haitian immigrants whose origins belong to a neo-Nazi group in Ohio.
Meanwhile, we're not even talking about immigration, right?
Exactly.
I mean, the bigger issue is we're talking about cats and dogs, and no one's talking about the real issue.
And the immigration issue is a real issue. Like, this is obviously a real challenge for a small town like Springfield, Ohio. Now, again, to be clear, the Haitians living in Springfield, Ohio, like most recent reporting on this that I have seen, these are not illegal immigrants. These are refugees. They have a legal status to be in this country. And the history of this country, us taking in refugees and assimilating them into our culture and into our economic life, has been a net benefit to our society. I think that's a very important thing for us to talk about. Now, should we talk about Western culture? How do we preserve the values of our Constitution and everything else? Sure, that's all a valid conversation. But let's just make sure that we're telling the truth. There's been interesting reporting on Haitians working in factories and retail and various job opportunities in the area where they needed people to come work. Let's just tell the truth about these stories as we process the good and the bad. Because the bad is that when you flood a small community with a refugee community, that strains the education system, that strains the healthcare system, that strains the civil system in a variety of ways. Those are fair points for people who are concerned about the state of our borders. And those are things that are worth having civil conversations about. But when the idea is, as JD Vance essentially said yesterday, create the chaos meme, the false meme of people eating cats, just to make sure that people start the conversation, that's called lying. We can't do that. And as Christians, we should reject it soundly.
Certainly, there's a lot of fact checking, live fact checking that goes on during the debates, people trying to figure out what is the truth from the lie. And one of the strongest moments, I think, in the Republican National Convention was when the families of those killed in Afghanistan took the stage. And on Tuesday, Kamala Harris looked straight into the camera and she claimed that we currently had no active servicemen in places of conflict. Fact check for me here, Mike. She has avoided talking about Afghanistan quite a bit, and this is a really bold claim.
If I were Kamala Harris, I would try to avoid Afghanistan as much as possible as well, because it's a very bad topic for her and her principal. During the debate, one of the things that she was very explicit about, and this is something Joe Biden has said as well, they're very proud of the fact that there are no American service people in active war zones. Now, to say that, you kind of need to put an asterisk next to it. What they mean is that we're living in a moment where American soldiers are not operating in a foreign theater under a force use authorization of some sort, whether it's an executive order or an act of Congress, which was what was driving a lot of our activity in Afghanistan and driving a lot of our activity in Iraq and other places around the world. If you don't pay attention to the news, if you dip in and you dip out and you hear that, it makes it sound like, wow, the Biden administration has worked really hard to get American troops out of harm's way. And that is just simply not true. First of all, the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a disaster. It was a foreign policy disaster on multiple levels. It was a disaster for our own service people because the process of the withdrawal was messy enough that, as Donald Trump has pointed out many times, a number of American servicemen and servicewomen died in the process there during that withdrawal. But just this year, literally just this calendar year, the last 9 months, we have had a number of American servicemen and women die in the Middle East because of attacks at the hands of Iranian proxies, including 2 Navy SEALs who were killed early this year while engaging the Houthis from Yemen, who were trying to block off the Red Sea. I understand the impulse to say, hey, I got us out of all of these unnecessary foreign wars. And I think for Joe Biden in particular, who really blames the death of his son, Beau, on having lived next to these burn pits in Iraq, which he believes gave him cancer, I understand the impulse, both on a personal level and a national level, to say, let's get our troops home. Let's get our troops out of harm's way. But it's the same problem with these internet meme things that you have on the online right. Tell the truth about it. Are our troops out of harm's way? No. You have Iran funded militias firing on American positions in Iraq, in Syria, in Jordan all the time. It's happening constantly. You have the Houthis coming out of Yemen trying to cut off the Red Sea, which threatens not just American prosperity because of trade and everything else, but literally it threatens American troops. So throughout the debate, one of the things that you saw, and conservatives, right wingers, have complained about this nonstop since the debate ended. From the moment before the debate ended, they were complaining about this online, that the moderators were very intentional about fact checking Donald Trump on a few things, and they never fact checked Kamala Harris once on any of her issues. This would have been a great issue to fact check Kamala Harris and say, oh, so Americans are out of harm's way. Talk to me about the Americans who are consistently under fire from Iranian proxies in the Middle East. You don't consider that an active combat zone. Tell me why that is. And if she wanted to defend that statement, she would defend it through this, I think, a very technical answer about force use authorization, which at the end of the day is not very compelling when there are still rockets and drones being fired at Americans all over the region.
It was interesting to see where the moderators pressed in and where they didn't. And one of those topics also was abortion. We saw a lack of clarity from both sides on the abortion question. And we saw Donald Trump avoiding conversation about a federal ban. We saw Kamala Harris avoiding conversation about late-term abortion. Does this avoidance really reflect how Americans feel about the issue post-Dobbs now, do you think?
I think you just put that perfectly. Absolutely. People don't want to think about this. They don't want to talk about it. Because when you start to talk about it and when you start to kind of get to the brass tacks of where do you draw lines, what's in, what's out, what's permissible, what isn't, it gets very uncomfortable very quickly. Donald Trump has this habit. He says it in his stump speeches and he said it in the debate the other night, where he basically says what the Democrats want is for a woman to be able to give birth and then execute the baby after the fact. The debate moderators fact checked him on that and said that's not legal anywhere in the country. And technically, within sort of a narrow set of definitions, what the moderator said was correct. There are no hospitals in this country where you would walk into a maternity ward, give birth to a child, and then look over at the OBGYN and say, actually, I don't want the baby. And they would then terminate the baby. That's illegal. Doesn't happen. What does happen is, frankly, at times so adjacent to that that it's brutal to think about. I believe there's 6 states in the country that allow either partial birth or extremely late-term abortions. There are also states in the country, and I think this is one of those things where people who are so quick to say, hey, this never happens, what Trump is saying is untrue, they need to reckon with the Born Alive Act, which is to say that there are abortion processes that result in a live child being extracted from a live viable child being extracted from their mother's womb. And the Born Alive Act, which has been enacted in a number of states, essentially says if that happens, essentially it's a failed abortion and the child lives, you got to save the child's life. You got to take the kid to a hospital where they can care for them. That's, again, it's grotesque to think about how these things happen and go down. People don't want to think about how these things happen and go down. And Trump is such a bad spokesperson for these things because he's just generally grotesque as things are. But when she was pressed on those issues, what about the 7th month? What about the 8th month? She wouldn't give an answer. She was trying to deflect all of that. And when Trump said what he said, which again was untrue, the fact checkers fact checked him in a way that passes the minimal smell test of truth to say, well, what you described isn't true. Something very, very closely adjacent to it is true and is happening in 6 states in this country. And I think, as Christians wrestle with this stuff, we've got to keep that before us. What's remarkable is that in the debate, Trump refused to make any kind of statement about his own willingness to defend the right to life. So when Harris was pressing him, would you veto a bill that protected the right to life? He just simply wouldn't answer the question, just like she wouldn't answer the question if she would allow abortion in the 7th or 8th month. It's an incredibly uncomfortable question because when you start to press into it, you get into the flesh and blood reality of what we're talking about, which is the life of a child. And people don't want to deal with the flesh and blood reality of the life of a child. They want to deal with the abstractions and the sanitized language of politics. So I think them fact checking him and not fact checking her on this was gross negligence. And while I don't think that that flipped the debate by any means whatsoever, Trump lost the debate on his own terms. I do think those who are crying foul over it have a point.
For me, this begs the question, do you think Americans really want to turn the page? Kamala Harris talks about Donald Trump as more of the same, of going backwards. She encourages voters to turn the page to a new and more hopeful administration. But do you think Americans actually want to look out for the vulnerable? Do you think that Americans actually want to see neighbors among us instead of adversaries? In calling us to our better angels, do you think that Kamala Harris is trying to tap into something that, if we're being really honest, is dead in American psyche, in American spirituality, in American life?
I guess I'm not quite cynical enough yet to say I think it's dead because I think there's something like even inside MAGA, like forget the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Laura Loomers and the wild, loud online right. My hunch is because of the nature of our culture, I think we're still in a place where if you ask difficult questions about how do we protect the lives of women who have been sexually assaulted, and there's consequences to that related to the abortion laws, or how do we protect Haitian refugees who are escaping literally cannibalistic gangs that are tearing their own country apart, or people that are escaping brutal totalitarian regimes other places in the world, even the most MAGA hat wearing person in the country, if you sat down and talked about, hey, here's a story, here's a circumstance, what would you do? You'd find somebody who wanted to find a humane response, which is to say, like, I do still, maybe naively, believe in the fundamental decency of the American people. And part of that is because I believe the vast majority of them are not online and not sucked into the grotesque whirlwind that drives that world. The problem that we have, the problem that we keep coming back to, is political leadership. Do we have political leadership that can cast a vision that compellingly paints something different? Clearly, that's the tack that Harris is trying to take here. She's chosen not to lean into the democracy under threat language that really drove the Biden campaign. She did it last night as well. She's chosen to dodge getting drawn into identity politics stuff about her race and her background and all the rest. And she's saying, I want to be focused on these other things. How much is that true? How much is that rhetoric? How much is that hypocritical given other policies that are part of her? That's all welcome. That's all debatable. Here's what's not debatable. Donald Trump is today the same Donald Trump that stood in front of the American people in 2016 at his own inauguration and talked about American carnage. Donald Trump stood there and over and over and over again the other night said, our country is a disaster. Our country's in the toilet. Our country is a wreck. Our country is losing. People are laughing at us. This is a horrible place. If I had to kind of go with my gut about where the American people are and where the rest are, I think the American people have their complaints. Gas is expensive. Eggs are expensive. Meat and chicken and beer are expensive. Like, people are going to complain about the consequences of inflation and these various things. But I don't think most of them are looking around and going, this is a horrible place. And so long as that's Trump's central message, I think that hurts him more than helps him.
Well, it was certainly an interesting evening to get to enjoy together, and we have 53 days to go. So don't get exhausted. The end is in sight now. We will be right back. Last Sunday, American singer Taylor Swift attended the U.S. Open Tennis Championships with her boyfriend, Travis Kelce. While Taylor's whereabouts always interest fans, this particular social engagement drew ire from fans who were irked to discover that Kelce and Swift were sharing a box with fellow Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes and his wife, Brittany, who are, gasp, Trump supporters. Just 2 days later, after the debate, Swift posted to social media that she was dispelling rumors and officially throwing in her lot with Kamala Harris for president. Joining us to talk about the Kansas City Chiefs and maintaining friendships across difference is our good friend and rabid sports fan, Bob Smetana. Bob, thanks for being with us today.
Okay, wait a second. I have
Yeah.
to interject here for just one moment because you said the Mahomes are Trump supporters. However, Patrick Mahomes has come out in the last 24 hours to say he is not endorsing a candidate this season. He respects his wife's decision and he just wants to play some football. So
That's right.
it
I
is
stand corrected.
what we were dealing with here is a Brittany Taylor situation. So from there, I will turn to our resident Brittany Taylor expert, Bob Spontaneous.
I am not a resident dealer, and I tell you, it hurts me because I am a rabid New England Patriots fan who beat the Chiefs many times. But I do also like Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. So this is a great story because it's everything all in one. So what's different about this is you have two of the most famous players in football and their significant others. You have a presidential election. You have, the biggest star in pop music, who is also a childless cat lady, apparently. And you have social media so that somebody, because all this starts with Brittany Mahomes liking something about the GOP platform on Instagram. And of course, the people on Instagram, I went to Instagram to find this, and all I found was people being nice, giving their supportive and constructive feedback about her decision and how she destroyed America by liking something on Facebook. I think this is really interesting because I think, like all Americans, we're going to have to figure out what to do. Taylor and Brittany are going to have to figure out what to do after this election's over, right? Their team wants to win a Super Bowl. They want their significant others to win a Super Bowl. They're still going to have to be within each other's company. There's probably something to learn from this about how do we not let everything destroy these relationships. Because no matter who wins, half the country's going to be really mad in the fall. And they're going to have to learn to the other people and figure out how to live together for the next 4 years. Just like if this were to cause a rift between Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, that would be bad for the Chiefs. A rift between half America and the other half America would be bad. So I think that maybe showing something of interest, of like, friendship is more important than this. We're going to have to figure this out afterwards. It's also the interesting to me just how much social media runs everything. A story can become somebody likes something on social media, someone on social media is mad about it. Is that a story? I don't know.
So before social media, were there sports figures like Taylor and Brittany who somehow figured out how to get along and modeled that for their fans?
So I asked Paul Putz, who's a professor at Baylor who studies sports and religion, about this. One thing he said is that there's always been, in every locker room and every team, there's always different politics, and sometimes that plays a role. But he made an interesting comparison to John Wooden and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So John Wooden was the famed coach at UCLA of the best college basketball team ever. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was one of the greatest college players ever, perhaps one of the greatest NBA players ever, right? So they were on different sides. Wooden supported Nixon. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar did not. But they had a lifetime friendship that they didn't let their politics. He said that's probably the best example. Now, it's harder now because politics has become so much of our identities. But what he said is basically, when you have a goal that's bigger than your politics and your friends and you're trying to accomplish that goal, it can, if you keep your eyes on that, keep folks together.
Mike, of course, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is way before social media. Yes. How do you see that social media has affected and perhaps infected friendships in the last 8 years?
Social media's distorting effect is so on display in the story in a way that's really interesting. Because the idea was that a few weeks ago, Brittany Mahomes goes on Instagram. And if you think about who Brittany Mahomes is culturally, where she fits in, class-wise, she's the owner of a multi-million-dollar soccer team. She's a business owner. She's these, you can kind of tick off most of the check boxes for the kinds of indicators that would make you think, Yeah, of course she's going to vote Republican. There's an element to which it's like, well, of course, it's not surprising that Brittany Mahomes is a Donald Trump supporter. And if you asked her why, she's not a Donald Trump supporter because she thinks January 6th was awesome and she wants to end democracy or any of those things, but she's supportive of certain policies that make a lot of sense for women's sports and taxes and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, the grossness of the moment that we're living in is that people hear that and then they immediately say, well, obviously we need to cancel this person. Taylor Swift needs to shun this person and no longer be friends with this person because they have committed the unforgivable sin and said something positive about Donald Trump in public. Look, I've got a very long, unbroken record of criticism of Donald Trump wrapping back for 8 years. But if I cut every person out of my life who was supportive of Donald Trump for reasons that I find abhorrent or silly or unconvincing or whatever the case may be, I'd lose a whole lot of friends. And my friends are more important to me than my politics. And I think that is missing in our current cultural moment.
So we've talked about politics, we've talked about sports, we've talked about social media. I feel like there's a sort of shadow topic that we haven't touched on yet. So since Taylor Swift entered the Chiefs' orbit, fans have been watching her as she relates with other players' families. And I suspect it's more than just voyeurism that has us watching to see whose box she's sitting in. I wonder if we're taking cues on how to navigate our own friendships. Like we all wish that there was a Brittany Mahomes that we could sit with in the same box. And I wonder if behind all of this is a shadow of loneliness.
There's been a lot of research over the last number of years that shows that the decline of intimate friendships is a real thing, especially among adults. And what's interesting about this story is we're talking about Brittany Mahomes and Taylor Swift. They sat in separate luxury boxes at the game on Thursday night. And everybody was like, oh, look, Taylor, she's shunning Brittany Mahomes because she endorsed Donald Trump. And then 2 days later, they're sitting in the same luxury box at the US Open. So clearly everything's fine there. And we should be happy about that. It's a healthy culture where people who disagree about policy outcomes can end up sitting together and enjoying the US Open together. Like that's a gift. Thank God for democracy. Thank God for pluralism. Let's embrace that. And good grief, get over it. Let's not try to cancel Brittany Mahomes or Taylor Swift for it. What you're bringing up is the exact reason why, which is that so much of the way our culture and our society is designed today is that it's designed in such a way to splinter friendships or to drive people away from deep lifelong friendships. You know, if you're a parent, your time is divided between work, where you're providing for your family, and your kids' extracurricular activities. We understand the way that life just gets you splintered in all these real directions. And when the rare moment opens up, whether it's at church or at a sporting event for your kids, where there's like a lull, when you get to have a real, intimate, honest, vulnerable conversation with another adult about what's going on in your life, it's an incredibly powerful thing. That's a massive opportunity for the church. There have been multiple studies over the last 3 or 4 years that have shown that the average American male cannot say he has one close, intimate friend to whom he can sort of share anything that is going on in his life. That's a crisis on all kinds of levels. It's a spiritual crisis, it's a social crisis, and I would argue as well, it's a political crisis. Because if the only place that you can find meaning and belonging and purpose is in a political movement, even if that political movement is gathering in Charlottesville and waving tiki torches in the air and saying Jews will not replace us, we're so desperate for that story and that community that we will make detrimental decisions to our own personal thriving in order to be able to participate.
The lovely part about this story is that football trumps all that stuff, right? People love this stuff. They want to go to the game. They want to cheer for their team. The thing about organized sports, especially kind of gigantic mass sports, is it has something to do with the game and the statistics and stuff. It really is about the story that's going on, about being part of the stuff. Like, I think this does show that the things that matter to us in day-to-day life are often other things than politics, right? Politics does not rule. This is more of a story because people are trying to glom on to Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift at a football game is like, the football people are like, wait, what is going on? Taylor Swift this year, people are watching her. Yes, she's a big phenomenon. But football and these sporting events are big things where people cross boundaries. It's one of the places where people cross racial boundaries, they cross political boundaries, they cross economic boundaries. And if it doesn't become toxic, which it can, and you become, I hate the other side. Like I like Mike, his team and my team have clashed in the past. It didn't always go so well for one team, but we still talk. We are not holding against each other. Mike and I have had lunch together. He hasn't poisoned my lunch, at least as far as I know. Right? So these things can...
But I do hold a very, very deep grudge for the inflation scandal. And you know this. And
inflation scandal. Oh my gosh. This was the inflation scandal. Dude, maybe if the quarterback threw the ball to the right team, that would help. And they were cold, and they were mean to our receivers. And oh my gosh,
the rules don't matter. The rules don't matter. But anyway, but I still love you, Bob.
There's fun. There's like your joy.
The point stands. The point stands that we can still have lunch together,
yes.
Even though you don't seem to care about the rules as much as the
rest of us. We all care about the rules. So anyway, this is great. I love this stuff. Now we're talking about football on the news, and we're talking about the way football overcomes all evils.
Amen. Poor Clarissa's sitting there going, what do I do with these two old men yelling at each other about a conflict that was in the NFL 10 years ago?
This has become unhinged.
It has. I'm so sorry.
Thanks so much, Bob. This has been a rollicking good time. Listeners, word of mouth is our best advertising. So here's an idea. Grab a friend or a potential friend and ask them to listen to the show along with you. Text about it, talk about it, use it as your excuse to find some common ground with someone you're hoping to get to know better. We will see you next week. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by TJ Hester. Theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.